All right, welcome everyone this evening. Tonight we're going to be talking about tomatoes and peppers in the home garden. My name is Adam Watson. I am the Washington County UT Extension Agent for Agriculture. In fact, one of three as of May 1. So we were very happy to have Elena come on board with us. She was previously our program assistant. She's now on board as a full-time ag and 4-H agent. So we were very happy to see her come on board with us. So let me just mention as we go through the presentation this evening, it's very possible I'll be mentioning some trade names or brand names. Please don't view that as being any sort of endorsement or approval from myself nor the university. It's just so we have clarity on the topic, and it certainly wouldn't be to the exclusion of similar products. So generally speaking, on a lot of things, particularly pesticides, there are active ingredients that are important, but there may be multiple brands or trade names that are certainly more than readily substitutable for one another. Also, in reference to pesticide products, make sure you read and follow all label directions. You often hear extension folks say the phrase, the label is the law, and in truth it is. So we must always make sure we do follow those directions. It allows us to use those products effectively and safely. So why talk about tomatoes and peppers? Well, they're two of our most favorite garden crops that we grow. If you look at almost any number or list or accounting of most grown vegetables in home gardens, tomatoes and peppers are almost always in the top 4 at least. If we look even on a commercial level and actually look at levels of consumption and sales, tomatoes and peppers are also at the top. And I think in part it's because they're so versatile in the kitchen. So if you think about across the world, just how many different cultures and cuisines have tomatoes and peppers as a very important part of it. I mean, believe it or not, once upon a time, Italian food did not involve tomatoes. It's hard to believe, but until the quote unquote New World was discovered, tomatoes were not part of Italian cuisine. Or if we think of Thai cooking, what would Thai cooking be without peppers? And so to me, it's very impressive just how dominant and how often we find tomatoes and peppers in cooking from around the world. So certainly it's not a surprise they find a place in many kitchens. There are commonalities for these plants because they're both part of the same plant family, the Solanaceae or Solanaceous family, also called nightshade. So they are related to each other. We would also include potatoes and eggplants as part of that family as well. So it's very well represented in our garden. And so while they are very similar when it comes to care and pest and various other things, there are a few slight differences, and we'll try to touch on that some this evening. But you'll also find that if you can grow one well, most of the time you're going to grow the other one well. And with their popularity, it shouldn't be a surprise. University of Tennessee has a number of different resource publications that do have a focus on these crops. So you'll get the list of all of these in an email from me, but certainly some of these are very recent publications, nice up-to-date pictures and great resources. So a lot of the topics that I'm covering tonight, you will find in more depth in these publications. So please take a moment if there's something you want to consider further. You'll probably find greater information in these publications than I'm able to cover in the time span tonight. I do think it's worthwhile just to mention a few basic vegetable gardening thoughts about how we want to do things well. Essentially, we want our gardens in full sun, which is to say 6 to 8 hours of sun. Certainly, that's not the entire day, but as much of the day as possible, we would like to have full sun. Ideally, we have well-draining soils. If you're thinking about siding a garden somewhere and after a rain, a couple of days later, you go out there and the ground is squishing, it's probably not going to be the best place to put that garden because we want soils that will allow water to drain away once they become saturated. We're looking for a soil pH between 6 to 7 we can work with. Once it gets outside of that range, we would need to do some sort of amendment or amelioration to it to make sure we get in a better range, but 6 to 7 is very workable. The good thing is very often our native soils are already in that range. So oftentimes we don't have a problem. If you have an area, for instance, that's growing grass well, chances are that pH is going to work for a vegetable garden. And we also need to be thinking about fertility. One of the things I always like to encourage folks to consider is every time we make a harvest from a garden, we remove something, we're actually removing fertility. We're removing nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and micronutrients, calcium, magnesium. And so we don't want to always have that going one direction where we're only removing from our soils. We actually want to be adding back as well. And so there's a number of ways we can do that. Certainly fertilizer is a convenient way to do it, but also organic soil amendments can be another one that work well for us. I'll also mention that sometimes gardeners, they do a good job at doing a pre-plant fertilization. And so if you haven't done a soil test, which can be done through our office, the cost is $20, takes about 2 weeks to get results back. If you don't have a soil test, I'd probably recommend that you look at doing probably about 1/4 pound of actual nitrogen per 100 square feet. The amount of fertilizer you would apply would actually depend on what specific fertilizer you're using because they vary in nitrogen content. And we also want to think about coming back later in the season and doing some side dressing with nitrogen. Without a soil test, I'm probably not going to recommend phosphorus or potassium, either one. Generally, our soils are in pretty good shape with that. Not always, but generally we're in good shape. So without a soil test telling us that we need those, we probably won't recommend those. But side dressing is just where you come back during the growing season and you add additional fertility, specifically nitrogen. The reason we don't put down all the nitrogen at the beginning of the season is nitrogen becomes unavailable. It can move, whether it's through runoff or things like that. It actually be turned into nitrogen gas and be lost to our garden. So we don't put everything down at once. We also, particularly with peppers, for instance, if we are oversupplying that plant with nitrogen, so if we're just putting a tremendous amount out there all at once, we can actually keep that plant growing vegetatively. And so we'll have a 4-foot tall pepper plant that's dark green and beautiful and absolutely no blossoms and consequently no peppers. So we don't want to do that. And so coming back with in-season nitrogen fertilization or side dressing with nitrogen is always recommended. And you can see this is just part of the chart from this publication. So it's not just our tomatoes and peppers. We do this too. It's other plants as well. And you can see the timing to do this side dressing for both is basically when our very first fruits on those plants are about 1 inch in diameter. And so there are some preferred products. We like using calcium nitrate with this fertilization if we can, if it's available to us, simply because by putting more calcium out there, we're hopefully going to avoid blossom end rot. We'll talk later more about that. So if you have no idea what blossom end rot is, don't worry. We'll cover it in some detail. Talking briefly about tomatoes, they are obviously a frost sensitive crop. So some people might think, why in the world would I wait to early May to have this class? Because early May is exactly the time we need to be planting these. So basically I advise don't try to put these out in our gardens before May 1st. Certainly if you're growing in containers and you can move them if there's expected cold weather snap or frost coming, you may have a little more leeway with that, but if we're planting these out in the ground in the garden, May 1st is about the earliest it makes sense. And part of the reason is it's not just the air temps, it's also the soil temperature that's important. Generally speaking, very few gardeners ever measure this, but you want to measure it about 3 to 4 inches deep. And you would want a minimum temperature of at least 55 degrees and higher would be preferable. And so what happens sometimes, we can put tomatoes out there and even if they don't suffer a frost, they're kind of just sitting there because everything's so cool, they're really not doing much growing. So you're not gaining a lot necessarily by putting things out there early, and you may actually be stressing them. And there is certainly research that shows early stresses on plants can reduce their yield overall. So I think anytime we can avoid an unnecessary stress to plants, it's in our benefit to do so. One thing about tomatoes, although they are frost sensitive, they're what we would generally call a warm season crop. It can get too hot for them in our region. And so if you've ever grown tomatoes and you've had good production on tomatoes, but then for a while you don't get any tomatoes and then they start again, you very well may have experienced flower abortion due to temperatures. So when we have daytime temperatures with tomatoes above 85 degrees, and when we have nighttime temperatures where they're staying above 72 degrees, and it is somewhat variety dependent. There are certainly some varieties that have been bred for higher temperature tolerances. We can find those in the marketplace, but by and large, when we're above 85 degrees during the day and we're above 72 at night, we'll find that we can lose flowers. They simply aren't going to be pollinating, so we don't have fruit. So we can have issues with too high a temperature, even though these are one of our warm season crops. One thing about tomatoes that generally pops up with a lot of gardeners is how do we do pruning, or do we do pruning? And so it comes down to, we have two main types of tomatoes. They're indeterminate and determinate. An indeterminate tomato basically keeps growing all season long. It doesn't stop growing until it dies. So maybe it succumbs to pest, or it get hit with a frost in the fall. A determinate plant, on the other hand, generally stops growing when it reaches a specific size or height, typically about 4 feet, 5 feet tall. Determinate tomatoes are often called bush tomatoes in the trade, so you may see them referred to as bush tomatoes. And the difference is a determinate tomato, because it does stop the growing, it has a more concentrated harvest period. And the indeterminate has a larger harvest overall, but it's stretched out over a longer period. So either one works great in gardens. Just understand the difference. The challenge is with indeterminates, we do like to do some pruning. So indeterminates, and you see here depicted on this graphic, you have a young plant that's growing there. You've got your first flower cluster. What you want to do is keep the first sucker. Now, a sucker is just an adventitious stem or limb that starts growing between a stem and the main trunk. What would ultimately happen with these is this would develop another growing stem, so it'd make a bigger plant. What we do is we keep the first one in place, and then we remove any below that. And what that does is allow more of the energy of the plant to be focused on those early flowers and fruit. So it helps speed the first harvest. And it also keeps the plant to a little bit more manageable size. You can actually sucker plants more than once. If you allow the suckers to get large accidentally, when they're small, you can just go through and just, break them off real easy with your fingers. You can actually sometimes miss one, or maybe purposely let them get larger, and you can actually root these. And so some people will actually root suckers, and they have now another tomato plant to plant out. So it's something that if you don't sucker your tomatoes, it's not a huge deal. You may be delaying your earliest tomatoes on your indeterminate plant. They may not be as large as they might have been, but you are ending up with a larger plant at the end. One reason we like to do it is it helps reduce the plant size, and that can improve airflow in the garden, and sometimes just the manageability of the plants themselves. So again, determinates, typically we don't do that because determinates grow in a different pattern than indeterminates, but it is something that it's not a bad thing to do if you want to do that to those indeterminate plants. Peppers, also a frost sensitive plant. In fact, they're probably a little more sensitive to cooler temperatures than tomatoes are. So we might actually say we would want to be sort of into that second week of May before we start planting them out in the garden. Season to season, it may not make a huge difference, but certainly they do have a little bit higher minimum air temperature and soil temperature that they would prefer. peppers want a minimum soil temperature of about 60 degrees, which is warmer than the tomatoes. We can also have flower abortion with peppers, again, above 86 degrees during the day. However, with the peppers, it's more of a concern with if we have cool temperatures overnight. So if we have, especially late in the season, if we have peppers still growing, but we have nighttime temperatures dropping low, below 50 degrees, we can actually lose those flowers. And of course, there is variability depending on the variety we're talking about, but certainly temperatures do affect their ability to fruit as well. Transplant production, very similar. The thing to know off the bat, peppers take a little bit longer. Typically, peppers are more 7 to 8 weeks, while tomatoes are more about 6 to 7 weeks to produce a nice size transplant. Peppers are also generally, I think, a little bit slower to germinate. So you will actually, if you sow tomatoes and peppers at the same time, generally your tomatoes are up and going, and you're worried to death that your pepper seed wasn't good. Takes a little bit longer. Generally, you'll see that indicated on the seed packets. So just understand they're slower. Don't have a freak out about it or start replanting all your peppers thinking that you have to start over. Both of them you can see harvest, depending on what variety we're talking about, in 55 to 60 days. I will say that if we're talking about the colored peppers, typically we would add 20 days or so to those figures. Generally speaking, peppers first turn green, and then they'll get the color to them. So anytime you see the red, the oranges, the yellows, etc. on peppers, typically they first turn that green color. Generally speaking, from a culinary standpoint, we can use those green peppers perfectly for our uses, but there are some folks that do say certainly you get a different flavor when you allow those peppers to mature to a different color. So that may be something, if you're not used to doing that in your garden, maybe giving that a try. I know I have a friend that is actually a commercial grower. He grows a number of different hot pepper varieties. And early on, when he was having migrant workers from South America work for him, one thing he had to do is he had to make sure that he trained his workers to pick green jalapenos, because they were very happy to pick the ones that were starting to turn red, because to them, they said the ones that are turning red are the ones that have the best flavor. Problem is, of course, if you have those mixed into a box that you're trying to sell to, your grocery store or distributor, you'll probably get rejected. So he had to make sure to train his workers that he couldn't have those red jalapenos in his boxes. And so certainly we do see maybe some differences in culinary cultures from around the world. And I think that's interesting. One way we can extend harvest with both peppers and tomatoes is looking at doing successive planting. So really on either of these, we can start planting in May, and we can keep planting through till July and still get a harvest as a fall crop. You can certainly plant at different times. So plant early, wait a few weeks, plant more, or you can plant short days to harvest crops and then plant later days to harvest crops. There's more than one way to get this harvest window extended. And certainly it can work whatever's best for you in your garden. Some people prefer to plant everything at once. So plant some quick maturing varieties, and those that mature later will give you that larger harvest period. Others would like to come back and plant maybe the same variety later and do the same thing. One thing I do find interesting is when it comes to peppers, we have a number of different species that we use. So with tomatoes, we're basically dealing with all the same species. Peppers, not so much. So certainly the capsicum annuums, those are the ones that are probably most prominent in home gardens. They're the bells, the jalapenos, the bananas, the serranos, and the poblanos. The Chinense, which is not from China, even though that's what that species name means. The habanero is another one that's kind of alone. Tabasco peppers actually are a different species than most others. And then we have the bacotums, which are kind of interesting and unique, not necessarily grown a lot. I've known some growers who have tried to grow these on a commercial variety. And one of the things about these is these do not produce until very late in the season by and large. So like Ubatuba peppers, very uniquely shaped. But they also have a very long growing season. So if you're growing those, just expect that they're going to be something that matures later than the rest of your peppers. So this accounts, I think, somewhat for some of the variety, but I also find it interesting that even within the same species, we have very different levels of heat associated with the members. So it's just interesting to me that we do have such a variety there. When it comes to both peppers and tomatoes, you are going to have benefits from doing some sort of staking, caging, or trellising. And there is no single right way to do this. You will see a whole host of different things advised from any number of different universities. All of them can work, and it really comes down to what you want to do in your garden. The very left picture there, the actual drawing, is an example of the Florida weave method, where you use stakes in between plants. Tomatoes, typically it's every 2 plants. Peppers, sometimes it's 3 or 4. And then basically you run twine on either side of the plant. So they're sort of corralled in there by that twine. Works very well. You do multiple tiers as the season goes along, as the plants get larger. We like doing something to keep these plants up off the ground because there's a number of different diseases that are very often soil borne. So if we're reducing the likelihood of interaction between the soil and the leaves and the fruit, we're actually reducing some of our pest pressure that could be present. And so it can also help us just with picking. We're not having to go as low. If you've ever allowed, especially indeterminate tomatoes, just to run all over the ground, trying to get to the center of the patch to actually harvest, you've got to step carefully. So when we can keep these managed in a way with some sort of growing apparatus, it works well. I will caution you, on the right-hand side, you see the wire tomato cage, as it's referred to. Those can work well with determinate plants, especially because they have larger size ones that are even like 4 and 5 feet tall. Those do not work well for indeterminate plants. Indeterminate plants will absolutely grow much too large for that. It can collapse one of those without too much difficulty. So certainly think about the ultimate size that plant will be. I think it would be very hard to overbuild your caging system for indeterminate tomatoes. You can certainly give it a try, but think about that final size and consider that when you construct something. I really like to encourage folks to use mulch in the garden. And I don't necessarily mean the bag mulches we can buy at any number of home improvement stores. There's a lot of different possible options. But mulch in general, no matter what the form we're talking about, it performs several good functions for our garden. It reduces the water loss from the soils. So that's always good. It means we're going to be watering less. It lowers the soil temperature, which is good because we can have soil temperatures get too hot to where that stresses plants. And a big one, I think that's good, it reduces weed pressure. So anytime we prevent sunlight from reaching the soil, we are going to be reducing the germination of seeds. And basically, most of our weeds are coming from the seed soil bank. So we have all the weed seeds in there. And as they're brought up to the surface through tillage and our activities, they're going to germinate if conditions are right. And one of the conditions that spurs germination is sunlight. And so by having this mulch down, it means fewer weeds. Those that do pop up typically are very easily just to physically pull. So it's a great thing. The other thing is when we're using organic mulches, and by organic, I just mean basically something that was once living. So it's not to ascribe to it organic certification. It's just a reference to where it comes from. So organic mulches, which could include composted manures, animal beddings, hay, straw, lawn waste, leaves, any number of different things, wood chips, if I didn't already say that one. As they break down in the soil, they are also contributing to the fertility of the soil. They're increasing the organic matter. Increasing the organic matter is always a positive thing to do with our soils. At minimum, it helps add more nutrient retention as well as water holding capacity to our soils. So if you have a clay soil and you're wanting to improvement, one of the primary things and about the only thing that is reliably going to help you is adding organic matter to your soil. There is a big caution that we need to mention about persistent herbicides. So herbicides are a pesticide that kill plants. And what is happening, and with somewhat greater frequency, we're seeing carryover, particularly in animal manures, animal bedding, forages, and possibly lawn waste, but to a lesser extent currently, I think lawn waste. And what it is, there's three primary herbicides that we're concerned with, and they're basically related to each other. They're the aminopyralids, clopyralid, and picloram herbicides. What happens is these are used on the pastures or on the forages, the hay that the animals are eating, and perfectly in line with the label, the animal eats it, it goes through them, comes out as manure. The problem is in that manure is still a sufficient quantity of that herbicide to actually have an herbicide effect on our broadleaf garden plants. So our non-grass garden plants are going to be basically killed by this herbicide, or at minimum, their growth is going to be distorted because these are a form of synthetic auxin, which is basically a plant hormone. And so it causes distorted growth. We see the effects most sensitive for crops like tomatoes, peppers, tomatoes, beans, and peas are the most sensitive crops. So we can have things growing in the garden, no obvious problems. Right next to them, we'll have a tomato plant, distorted growth, twisted growth, strapping of the leaves, very obvious symptoms. So anytime we're using something that is either manure or contains manure, animal bedding, forages, so hay and straw, or lawn waste, we need to know, hey, what herbicides might have been used in the production of this. So I actually taught a class last night for a nonprofit in our region, and I had someone actually follow up with me from that class today and said, I talked to the guy that supplies hay for my horses. Here's the herbicide he says that he uses. Is this one I need to be worried about? And it actually wasn't. So, you know, if you're sourcing forages for your own animals, you need to ask this question. If you're having manure offered by someone to you, you need to ask them, hey, did you raise all your own hay or did you buy anything in? If they're under, you know, if their hay and forages are completely under their own control and they can tell you exactly what herbicide products they used, there's not a big risk. But if you don't know, I would encourage you not to use that source of material. The reason being is these can last for years, these herbicides in these residues. And in fact, you would think, well, what if we composted it? In fact, there's some research that indicates composting it may actually prolong its lifespan. So it's not a problem you want to deal with. It could cause you a disruption to your garden. So just be aware if you're using any of these sources that potentially could have these herbicides, that you ask those questions and get an answer to your satisfaction, yes or no, it's a concern. I do think it's worthwhile, since we're talking about growing things, to talk about how do we have happy, healthy plants and how do we deal with pests. And you may hear IPM in any number of talks or seen it in magazines, and it stands for Integrated Pest Management, and I'll talk on it further in just a moment. But to me, a big cornerstone or foundational stone for integrated pest management is that healthy plants resist pests. And so if we can make sure we have healthy plants through proper fertility, irrigating as needed, and truthfully in our region, most seasons, most crops are going to benefit from irrigation at some point. Doesn't mean we can't grow if we don't have irrigation in our garden, but it does mean typically we're not going to get the peak yield possible. Even doing things like planting at the proper time for whatever crop we're planting is important. IPM also involves a lot of non-chemical tactics that we can use either before we reach for a chemical control or maybe instead of. So there are some pests that we can certainly plant early or late and avoid a peak population. Sanitation of crop debris and rotation go hand in hand. Essentially, this says, as we have crops becoming non-productive, we remove those from the garden, and we don't plant back the same crop families in the same location successively. Ideally, we might have 3 years worth of time before we go back in the same location. And the reason behind both of these is many diseases and even insects can and do overwinter in crop debris. And so what happens is if we have plants that had a small level of a disease this year, if we go back and plant the same family of crops there, they likely have a susceptibility to that pest. And so we're already putting them in an area where it's very possible we have some surviving inoculum or disease source for that season. So it's like we are purposely planting something that we know is going to get sick. And so that's why rotation is so valuable and useful for us. It breaks that cycle so that next season, if we have a crop that is not susceptible to that disease isn't going to carry over, isn't going to overwinter. Maybe some of it does, because a lot of these pests don't necessarily all become available all at once. They last in the environment, but it certainly would lower that level of disease pressure. And the great thing about things like rotation is it really doesn't cost us anything directly. It may take a little more space out of our yards, but it's not a product that we're having to buy each season. So I think we get a lot of bang for our buck with rotation. Certainly, there are tactics like physical exclusion. Floating row covers can exclude any number of pests. It does sometimes get complicated depending on what variety or crop we're talking about, because of course we do have to have access for pollinators. So if we are using floating row covers early in the season on squash plants, for instance, we would have to remove them when they begin flowering, or we're not going to get squash. But certainly floating row covers can work well. Resistant varieties are one that I'll talk about in a moment. I think it's another good one for us to implement. And I think also, plantings for beneficial insects or refuges for those beneficial insects is important. One of the, goals of integrated pest management is that when possible, we have a balance to our ecosystem. And, as much as possible, we allow things to right themselves. So as a pest increases, hopefully we have beneficials that would increase and help keep those under control. And so providing areas and food sources such as nectar, flowers, can help us accomplish that. If you think of nothing else with integrated pest management, I just like to think of it as you don't first reach for a chemical control. So these other strategies are something that we use, and all with the idea of supporting a healthy plant. So when it comes to pests, certainly peppers and tomatoes can have their share, but I also think that these are two crops that can do well in our gardens, even if we're not going to spend a tremendous amount of effort on direct pest control. Part of it is I think we've got good disease-resistant options on both of these. And while there are insect pests, there are perhaps fewer than some other crops. So I think it's very easy for a gardener to have some success with tomatoes and peppers. I like resistant varieties. They just always give us a leg up against the pest pressure. So if you've ever seen a tomato seed packet, and for instance, this Roma tomato where it has VF after it, oddly enough, it doesn't say it anywhere on this packet because I looked, but that VF is actually telling us that it is resistant to both verticillium and fusarium wilts, which are actually two different diseases that tomatoes can get. Doesn't tell you that, but that is in fact the case. There on your screen, you will see a catalog listing for a variety. All those letters that are listed there in orange or red, that is different diseases. And so they would have a key in that section that would tell us exactly which diseases those were referencing. So you will find that a lot of the most resistant or most highly resistant varieties are more modern. They've been specifically bred. They are typically hybrids. That's not to say we can't find some resistance in some of our heirloom or open pollinated plants, but very often the greatest resistance is found is in more modern varieties. There are any number of pests that we do not have any sort of resistance in the plant for. So it's not a cure-all for all pests. And a very big thing for us to understand, resistance is not the same thing as immunity. So just because the Roma tomato may have resistance to verticillium or fusarium wilt doesn't mean if we have a stressed plant and that disease inoculum available that we won't have a plant become infested by it or infected. So it is resistance only, which means it gives us a benefit, not the absolute certainty that it won't happen. Insect pests are something that, by and large, there are both more generalist insects that are shared by any number of crops throughout the garden that will affect tomatoes and peppers or the Solanaceous family. And there are a few that are more specialist. So I'm going to talk about some of these. None of these are necessarily anything that would, absolutely show up in everyone's garden. Some of them are a little interesting maybe, but certainly I think it's worth spending a few minutes on it. So aphids, if you're not familiar with it, very common insect throughout the landscape. There are many different species. Some are very specific to what crops they'll attack. Others are more generalist. The good thing is when we find these infestations early, very easy to control. You can even use non-chemical methods such as blasting them with water and actually just knocking them off the plant if it's a small infestation. We had a fall garden at a school in Washington County this past year. We had planted out some broccoli. I was looking at it one week, found we had some aphids on the broccoli. I simply removed the lowest leaves on the plant because that's where they were at. They hadn't spread. It hadn't reached a large population yet. Took care of it. Didn't have to do anything further. And that's one thing that I think is important with integrated pest management and us having success in our gardens. You do need to be out in your garden looking for pests. And no disrespect to anyone that's getting older, but if you use reading glasses, you need to have those with you in the garden because we're talking about very small insects. And so you need to be able to find these. They're not going to be on top of the plant because think about it. Insects are food to a lot of different other things, other insects, birds, reptiles, amphibians, any number of different things eat insects. So that means they're typically hiding underneath the underside of leaves, in plant whorls, different places like that. If you're just casually looking down at your plants, you're not going to find these pests when they're in low numbers. So that means you've got to be turning leaves over. You've got to be getting down there on eye level with these different areas and really looking for them. When you do that, you find these early and they're much easier to deal with. So certainly there's any number of beneficial predators out there that will eat these. One of the best ones folks are familiar with are ladybugs. So certainly that can help us, but we do need to be aware that if these get established, they can definitely cause significant damage in our plants. They basically suck out the sap from plants, which of course is going to reduce production. We do have some pests that can do double duty, so to speak. So they can actually attack more than one crop. So corn earworm or tomato fruit worm is exactly the same insect. It just depends which one it happens to be eating on, what we're calling it. And so they are one that, basically eats a hole in something and then you get decay and it makes it even worse. So it's not just the direct damage from the feeding, it's also the secondary invader of the decay organism that causes a problem. What's good is we've got some great options. Sometimes with organic controls, we don't have a great option. On this one in particular, we have a really good organic option of Bacillus thuringiensis sprays or BT sprays. They work best, again, when we have small caterpillars. The way BT works is the caterpillar has to eat. the BT, and then it forms a protein in their stomach, and that's what ultimately kills them. So you can dunk a caterpillar in BT. It's not going to hurt it. It has to eat it. So you have to put it where these caterpillars are eating, and it's better to have it in place before they are inside of fruit, for instance, because once they're in that fruit, they're not going to probably come outside and eat on the outside of that tomato. Flea beetles are, again, one that we can find on any number of different plants. These will feed on peppers, eggplants, tomatoes as well, potatoes. They'll feed on broccoli and all the brassicas. So if you've got them in your garden, they'll find something they can eat. Oddly enough, there's even some native solanaceous weeds that they will absolutely devour first before they move over to our crop plants. So sometimes we'll see damage on a weed before it's actually attacking crops. Basically, they're called flea beetles because they're small, black. Some of them have stripes, but they're very small, they're very dark, and they do kind of jump. So it's a very apt name. They make small little holes in leaves. So it kind of looks like someone went through and poked little tiny holes all in the leaf. What often happens is if you have a healthy, otherwise actively growing plant, they will outgrow the early damage from flea beetles. If you have a stressed plant, you can lose that plant. So floating row covers are one option. So as soon as you plant these plants out, cover them over with a floating row cover. That lets you keep them excluded from the plant. That can work well. There are certainly different pesticide recommendations, and I should say that with every pest I've mentioned to this point, even aphids, there's any number of options. Those resources that you'll be getting from me will have those listed, and so certainly that's a great way for you to find it. I don't like necessarily just running through a list of products and saying use this, use this, use this, because quite honestly, I think there's better ways for us to spend our time. So certainly those resources will be available to you, and will answer what product can I use best for these pests. Colorado potato beetle. This is one that actually overwinters as an adult. So even though it says potato beetle, it will certainly attack all the solanaceous crops we have. If we find this one early in the season and we're removing the adults, and we're making sure if we see those eggs, as you see in the upper right, we're squishing those or pulling that leaf off, we can actually keep the numbers very low. The challenge with Colorado potato beetle is they have significant resistance to any number of different insecticides that are available to us. They are kind of the poster child when it comes to an insect developing resistance to insecticides. I've never found out the exact reason why. I just know that they are prominently known for being able to do that. So certainly there's a number of different organic options that should work to good effect. There are some newer conventional insecticides that work well, but kind of some of the old ones, such as carbaryl, which at least used to be 7. So now there are 7 products on the market that no longer contain the active ingredient carbaryl. They contain a different one, or malathion, which again is an old one that's still available on the market that a lot of people are familiar with. Neither carbaryl nor malathion would be the first one I reach for with this insect. And if I have a sustained population where I'm treating multiple times, I would change up. I would not use the same exact insecticide every single time. Using the same insecticide repeatedly is going to push these to gain resistance. And so that means you will lose the efficacy of whatever product you're using. So certainly hand picking works great early, preventing those populations from building, and then rotating what insecticides you're using for these. Stink bugs are one that probably a lot of us are familiar with. The brown marmorated stink bug, kind of in the bottom center there, is the one that we find in our house in winter. It is also a pest in our gardens. So they have a wide number of species they will feed on. There are other stink bugs in our region, the brown as well as the green. And as you would expect, the green one is there in the bottom corner, and the brown one looks very similar but is brown. The damage they cause is not necessarily tremendous to the fruit. They will feed not only on the fruit but also on other parts of the plant. But if you're trying to sell this product, you're going to have a problem. So there you can see the discoloration on the tomato. Oftentimes it looks yellow on tomatoes. It can also look white. There you see a pepper that the damage has been cut open, and you see those white tissue layers in that fruit. Those are sometimes called cloud spots, but that discoloration, and actually there's a different texture to those spots as well. It's more corky. That's the damage they do. And so certainly if you're eating out of your home garden, not a huge deal. You can just cut around it. But this is something, especially for commercial growers, they have to be very proactive because, again, most consumers aren't going to accept these as a product they're purchasing. So just be aware that they do cause a significant amount of damage. We do have products that can be effective on these, and they are a common pest in our region. Not all stink bugs are actually a problem, though. So this is actually a two-spotted stink bug. There's more than one color form of it. You see them both represented as adults there on your screen now. This is actually a predatory insect. So it eats other insects, and it doesn't directly attack any of our plants. So even though stink bugs are a bothersome pest in our garden, there are also stink bugs that are also beneficial insects. So identifying what insect we have in the garden is important. We wouldn't want to take efforts to kill this insect, and certainly we would the others. So identity is important and is actually an integral part of integrated pest management. Tomato hornworm is one that I think is kind of interesting. Very often we don't find these caterpillars until they're very large, and so they can get big. They are a caterpillar, which is to say the larval stage of a moth. You see the moth there depicted on the bottom. What a lot of people first see in the garden that lets them realize they have a problem, they find the frass, which is to say the droppings or feces of the caterpillar. That's what you see depicted on the very top slide. You'll be walking down your tomato row and you'll notice all these black dots, and they're not small. They're decent size, especially with the larger caterpillars. That's what's first noticed. And then you might start noticing the missing leaves on some tomato plants. It's the green caterpillar that blends in very well with the plant. Oddly enough, if you have a UV light, these will actually fluoresce. So some growers will actually go out in their gardens at night, go through the tomato patch looking to see if they see any glowing worms. If they will glow, they'll stand out dramatically, so they won't be hard to find. We've got some good control products for these. BT, again, it's a caterpillar. So Bacillus thuringiensis products is one organic option that works well. It works best on smaller caterpillars. When they're very large, you're going to have less of a control option using BT, but certainly there are conventional insecticides that do well with it. If you ever see a tomato hornworm that looks like this, and it's very often you won't see this many on it, but what we're actually looking at are cocoons of wasp larvae. And so actually this caterpillar was parasitized by a wasp. So a wasp came up, laid its egg, or it did so repeatedly, or multiple wasp did, because each one of those is a baby wasp that is actually cocooning and will ultimately leave. They spend their time inside the caterpillar eating, and so the caterpillar itself basically isn't doing real great. It's not eating a lot, and each one of those cocoons is going to be a parasitoid wasp that can go and attack other hornworms. So this would be one. We want to leave this caterpillar in the garden because this is a beneficial insect at work. And so if we see this, we want to leave it, and it's going to be more wasp to control other hornworms. Mentioned earlier, lady beetles. Certainly, it's a common one that a lot of us think of when we think of beneficial insects. They do a great job of eating things like aphids, but they're not always that quintessential red and black spotted lady beetle, or even the Asian lady beetle that a lot of us are familiar with because of having them in our homes. The spotted lady beetle in the upper right hand corner is actually pink and black. Doesn't have that nice round shape to it that we think of, but it's still a beneficial insect. So again, making sure we understand what insects we have in our garden and who they are and what role they play can mean we can protect them and not waste control efforts on beneficials. One thing to understand is even the ladybugs that we're now all familiar with from the last slide, they don't always look like that. So when they are newly hatched out, you see them there in the upper left. They're very dark. They're very small. Certainly not what we think of. The two pictures below it are the larvae as they would be feeding on aphids on the plant. You can see different coloration to both of those. And they're both Asian lady beetle larvae. Again, does not look like that lady beetle. Or we may find the pupa. So after they go through the larval stage, as they are developing into the adult, they form the pupa and they'll emerge from that as the adult. That's what we see depicted on the right-hand side, those two pictures. So any of these are a positive thing to find in our garden. And any of them, if we're not familiar with them, might give us cause for concern, because certainly none of those look like a lady beetle to me. So again, understanding the different life stages that we will find with our beneficials is important. Didn't want to spend a tremendous amount of time on diseases tonight. In part, I wanted to keep this to about an hour in length, but I do think it's worthwhile maybe to spend a couple minutes on early blight. So of all the diseases that tomatoes and peppers can get, probably early blight's the most important one to talk about, and it doesn't affect peppers though. It will affect the other members of the Solanaceous family, so tomatoes and potatoes and eggplants, but not peppers. The reason I want to talk about this is one that when we have it in our gardens, it can be very destructive. Typically, we see problems beginning on the lower foliage of the plants, and that's because we're getting this from the soil in our gardens. So this is one that if we start having the disease in our garden, rotation is going to be critical. As long as possible is going to be our friend. So if we can, again, use mulch, prevent the splash, we're helping ourselves. There are resistant varieties, but what we want to make sure we do is actually have some physical distance from non-resistant varieties. And what I basically mean is, if you don't want to catch the flu, you don't go sit next to someone who has it. By the same token, if we've got both resistant and non-resistant varieties in our garden, we probably don't want to put the resistant next to the ones that are non-resistant, because the non-resistant will succumb to early blight, and then that will give us a huge disease pressure on our resistant, which again are not immune. So we'd like to keep any source of this disease away from our resistant plants if possible. We don't want to put ourselves next to a sick person, so to speak. So again, there are certainly good control options when it comes to fungicides for this fungus. One diagnostic key on this, and there's any number of different leaf diseases. UT actually has a foliar diseases of tomatoes publication that you'll get a link to. But one of the diagnostic features is the lesions on the leaves themselves kind of have a target spot look to them, meaning there's concentric rings. So they kind of look like a bullseye or a target that one might shoot at. And so that's one distinctive feature. This is one that a lot of people will talk about getting in their gardens. It could be other potential foliar diseases, but this is one that does cause problem when it's there. And so it's not uncommon, unfortunately, but it's one that we do have some good tools. This would be a great thing to catch early. Once we let it really get a foothold, we're going to have a problem with it. It starts on the foliage, but it will move to the stems as well as even the fruits themselves. So it is something that will directly affect fruit quality. This is one sometimes as those plants are getting older in the garden at the end of the season, you'll start seeing it really come in on plants. So just be aware of it and consider when you start seeing some problems, submitting a sample through our office, sending me some pictures, asking me to come out, take a look, because if it is early blight, we'd want to get ahead of it as much as possible and start looking at our control options. This is not a disease. So I want to put this one in here because this is probably one of the most common calls I get when it comes to tomatoes, but it also affects peppers. This is blossom end rot. So it's opposite where we have the stem on the tomato. And you can see it kind of presents in a few different ways. It can be on green fruit, it can be on ripe fruit, but what we notice is a sunken area, very often brownish in color, kind of leathery in texture. The bottom left picture is showing where there is a secondary fungus or other critter that's come in and is taking advantage of the dead tissue. This is not directly a rot of the fruit because it's not an organism. What this is a calcium deficiency. We can also find this on peppers, presents a little bit differently, but again, on the blossom end of the fruit, on those peppers that are more longer in shape, it's not uncommon to see curling of that bottom tip when we get this. And so it presents on both peppers and tomatoes. And again, it's not an organism, it's actually calcium deficiency. What it all comes down to is how calcium gets into the plant. And so it's not truly a deficiency in as much as our soils don't have calcium enough. It's that calcium is not in the fruit where it needs to be. So calcium is moved into plants by the flow of water moving into the plant. And when we have uneven watering happening in our gardens, whether we're relying on precipitation or we're not doing a good job with the watering frequency, what we get are rapid growth spurts. When that happens, the growth is so rapid in that fruit that the water that's making it to that fruit is not able to carry enough calcium. Calcium essentially kind of glues the cell layers together. And when that calcium is absent, it grows those cell layers, but they collapse. And that's why we get that depression, that sunken look to that affliction. And so it's all about how much calcium we're getting in the plant. I want to stress we solve this with water, not with more calcium. And I know earlier when we were talking about side dressing, we mentioned calcium nitrate. And part of that is it just puts more calcium there. But the reality is there's nothing we're going to add to our soils that fixes blossom end rot except more even watering. Because we can have as much calcium as we want to in that soil. How much gets to that fruit is dependent on how much water we have. And so making sure that as those plants are growing larger, we're increasing the frequency and quantity of our watering to that plant is important. Using mulch, again, one of the benefits, it helps conserves the water that we're adding to our soil and reduces the temperature so we get less loss through evaporation. And when we do water in our gardens, and basically this would work across all our landscape, we would prefer to be deep watering and infrequently. And what I mean by that, rather than going out and watering for a short period of time every single day, it would be much better to go out twice a week and water for much longer period of time. Because as we're putting more water to a greater soil depth, that is going to encourage that plant to grow roots to a greater depth and find that water. And so if you're not sure how much you're watering or if you're doing a good job, one of the absolute best ways is to actually dig down in your garden, stick your fingers in the pot, if we're talking about a container, and just feel how deeply is that soil wetted when you're done watering. If it's not 6 to 8 inches in most instances, I would say you are not watering enough, because we want to provide enough water in that soil that the plant has a reserve there that it can pull on during those hot days. So certainly if you want to, use calcium nitrate as a nitrogen source or add gypsum to your soil, which is calcium sulfate to increase calcium, that's fine. But until you get water dialed in, until you get better control of the water, you're still never going to get enough water into the plant. Calcium into the plant with the water, because the water is what's carrying the calcium. And so I have never seen a soil test in this region that is deficient in calcium. So it's not that our soils don't have enough calcium. It's simply we do a poor job with watering. So just be aware of that. One thing I like to mention about peppers and tomatoes both is they do get chilling injury if we get them too cold after we harvest them. So both peppers and tomatoes, we'd like to stay 45 or higher. And when we think about what temperature is our fridge hopefully at, it's going to be 40 degrees or lower. So we really never should be putting peppers and tomatoes into our fridge because they don't want to be that cold. And so we can actually be reducing the quality. We may think we're extending the shelf life, but we're actually reducing the quality of that product. They can actually become injured by it. The fruit gets watery, things like that. So ideally, we're not going to stick these in a fridge. So with that, we're going to have some questions. I appreciate your attention this evening.